Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. As you know, the last Thursday of every month, we join Professor Jonathan Feingold to teach a class we call Race Class. And Jonathan, I went back to our original press release from January 25th, 2022. This is how long we've been dancing together, Mr. Feingold, on this class called Race Class. And I'm going to remind everyone from that original press release why we were doing it. And I'm not quite sure we envisioned where we would be today. I think there was a fear, Jonathan, but I think the reality is so much more frightening. What we said was legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and Arnie Arnesen, host of The Attitude, are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And you ended the press release this way. In describing the foundational purpose of Race Class, Arnesen and Feingold note, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Welcome back years later, and we're living in a dystopian world. I am trying to figure it out, and I will tell you, I cannot. It's like everything that's happening every morning and every night seems like a caricature. It's like, this can't be real, but it is. And I have to start in a place that we actually talked a little bit about Harvard last month. Now I want to bring back Harvard this month. I have a connection to Harvard, Jonathan. In 1997, I was chosen as a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard, the Kennedy School. And it was a remarkable year for me. I'm not that smart. So I never would have been let into that institution. I went to these little schools, St. Olaf College, Vermont Law School. Harvard was this place that I just couldn't even imagine. And yet it was one of the most remarkable couple of months of my life. I will need to tell you, and I was somewhat provocative while I was there. No surprise, Jonathan. And I remember that the head of the Kennedy School, his wife came up to me one day and said, how are we going to exist without you, Arnie? Because I had brought so much interest and so much diversity of thought and talk at my school. And one of the things I do remember was, and this is very interesting to think about, there's a great quote by Bella Abzug, and Bella Abzug's quote, Jonathan, is, you have to lose, lose, lose to win, all right? Now, do you know what happened? A member of the Kennedy School pulled me aside and said, you can't call your class that. We don't have losers here. Oh my God. 1997, 2025. Let's talk about what's happening to Harvard, because it's an all-out assault. And how Harvard stands up is going to dictate how universities are going to try to figure this out going forward. Welcome back to the program after all these years, Mr. Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie. I do have a lot of thoughts on Harvard. As you know, much of my scholarship over the past 7 years or so has focused on Harvard's failure to zealously defend its own race-conscious admissions policy, and how that failure has enabled the attacks that we see today from the Trump administration, including all the rhetoric around colorblindness and meritocracy and equal opportunity. Harvard had an incredible platform to prophylactically diffuse some of those talking points by simply foregrounding all the ways in which its admissions process back in 2022 and today extends so many inherited advantages to wealthy white applicants. that, as a practical matter, is a racial preference, also wealth preference, but certainly a racial preference as well. Um, Harvard could have talked about all the ways in which anti-Black racism have sort of shaped the institution and its long sort of just sort of perpetual um, inability to meaningfully confront that, and simply just foregrounding how race continues to shape all contours of the institution in different sorts of ways. And so it's actually quite sensible to take race into account in the admissions process, because failing to account for it doesn't make it go away, doesn't make it any less powerful, doesn't make those
Right.
white benefits, any less salient. But by, you know, talking about race in a very sort of standard sort of way that actually reduces all the ways in which racial advantage actually shapes outcomes at Harvard. Harvard set up what we have right now. And today, in a few moments, I think we should talk at least a little bit about how the Trump administration, really building on the past 6 or so decades, is trying to resegregate the United States, or just
Yes.
to re-entrench all sorts of hierarchy, in part in the service of grift. Because,
Yeah.
um, whether it's the package going through Congress, much of what's happening now is at least in part designed to just naturalize all sorts of inequality and stratification in the United States, so that Amazon can just work everyone to death,
Hmm.
essentially.
Well,
Um,
let me just stop you there because I think you're right. But I think what also this bill does and what Donald Trump does is that they have the excuse that it's not that they're going to see all this wealth go to the top 1%. It's not only that they're going to resegregate, they're going to blame all the inequality of the past on the people that they are now basically saying are going to be removed to the back of the bus. Do you know what I'm saying? It's a twofer. Even though the people, everyone will be harmed except for that top 1%. But now, by having this opportunity through this war on Harvard, through this resegregation, through this dismantling of public education and vouchers, all the things that they're doing, it gives them sort of the opportunity to say, it's because we're trying to protect you, because of them, you feel insecure. Because of them, you are not able to succeed. And now we're going to make sure that them either go back to their country or go back to basically, working, as you pointed out, working to death in Amazon. But it's an interesting way of them framing it, because it is grotesque, but it's a perfect way of framing who you need to blame, even if it's not true.
right, and all that is just a way of saying race matters,
Yes. Race
and it's
matters.
trying parsing out, what we mean. And so, if you want to think of it from a Jason Stanley perspective, one of the ways in which the Trump administration is strategically mobilizing racial tropes, whether it's demonizing particular immigrants, whether it's wholly denigrating Black people in the United States, it is part of a much longer project of creating an us versus them mentality. That is part of, historically part of fascist politics wherever you are. Or if you want to think about someone like Ian Haney Lopez, who increasingly talks about strategic uses of racism. And as you said, when whenever Trump invokes a concept like meritocracy or equal opportunity, whether or not it's explicit, he's implicitly saying that the economic precarity that you are experiencing, you person who
Right.
self-identify as white, maybe working class, it's not because corporations have rigged the entire game, so that you don't have affordable health care, so that you can't let your kids don't go to well-resourced schools, and that the air quality is shitty. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on air.
We'll edit it
Scrub it
out.
if you need to edit out.
Yeah.
Um, uh, it's to suggest all of this, all the reasons why your life is hard is because of these undeserving people that have been getting handouts since the mid 20th century.
Right.
And that is a certain sort of narrative that stretches back long before then. But that is a way in which Trump, who is wholly obsessed with race, there is nothing that he does that is not animated by some sort of racial thing. And he, his understanding of the world is is through an like incredibly powerful racial lens. And I
Yeah.
think it just doesn't necessarily matter, but I seems like he believes a bunch of what he says. And if you look at the policies coming out of his administration, it includes policies that are attempting to uh, reclaim the notion that race is biological, which is
Mm,
inextricably linked to eugenics
right.
and theories of race that were um, deployed in order to justify overt racial hierarchy, whether that was slavery, whether that was Jim Crow in the late 19th, early 20th century. But all this is race. Let's circle back briefly to Harvard. Um, and then we can talk a little bit more about sort of one sort of recent investigation from the Trump administration that I think really uh, quite neatly clarifies that one of the goals of the Trump administration is to make it illegal to racially integrate. Um, so
No one says it that way. I just want you to, we talk about resegregation, but what you framed it as is to make it illegal to racially integrate. That no one says that, and I think that is unfortunate because I think that statement is a more accurate representation of what their agenda is, as opposed to a return to segregation. It is to make it illegal to racially integrate. That is a very powerful way of framing it.
and that is just an extension of what the Supreme Court ruled with respect to Harvard and UNC a couple of summers ago. Harvard and UNC, modest consideration of race in their admissions practices in order to sort of integrate their institutions that were both racially segregated, racially exclusive in different sorts of ways. And the Supreme Court in that case said, well, we're not going to say racial integration is an impermissible motive. That's what the Trump administration like wants to get to, but they said you can't pursue that goal by formally differentiating between individual students on the basis of race. But yeah, so Harvard, I zoomed into a webinar last night that was hosted by this new group called Crimson Campaign or something, alumni formation, very new, that is essentially organizing support around Harvard
Okay.
as Harvard becomes the punching bag of the Trump administration. And just a couple reactions. One is I think it is descriptively accurate to um, suggest that if Harvard falls, all of higher ed falls.
Yes.
And so there's a very critical um, role that Harvard is playing right now in as it's certainly not the only institution that is facing attacks from the Trump administration, but it is facing a seemingly sort of relentless, almost daily set of attacks that are um, traced back in part to the Trump administration's demand that Harvard cede all control to the Trump administration. And since Harvard refused to do that, the Trump administration has been essentially doing everything it can to strangle Harvard's ability to do what it does by cutting funding, by going after international students, which, in addition to um, really sort of deepening the research pedagogical educational environment at Harvard, is a key source of financial revenue for Harvard and other institutions. And so, again, just as a sort of matter of analysis, Harvard needs to withstand the attacks on the Trump administration, because if it goes down, it's just going to open the floodgates.
So I'm glad you had the opportunity to be at this meeting last night. Um, I'm kind of curious, what do they see as any doors that can be open? What avenues do they have? I mean, what is so interesting now is that they're actually talking about, basically going on boards of corporations. So it's not like they just want to control Harvard or destroy Harvard. They basically want to take control of every aspect. And a lot of those Harvard people that were in that Zoom call, I suspect are on boards of these corporations. And they're now connecting the dots between how they operate in the capitalist free market sector, how Harvard is now going to be incapable of acting in the higher academic sector. I mean, I am just trying to figure out how they were able to have a conversation and what they see as the opportunity not only to come together, but what does that mean and where did they go with that effort?
So, so it is accurate that the Trump administration is targeting universities in part because universities um, represent independent sites of power and knowledge production.
Yes.
They are places that are designed for people to be able to at least aspirationally pursue truth and knowledge for the common good, free from internal external interference, which means you can do research on vaccines, which means you can teach about war crimes in Palestine, which means you can talk about the United States enduring history of racial terrorism. Uh, and you can sort of identify all the ways in which the current administration is wielding race in order to carry out like a whole number of anti-democratic oligarchical goals. But there are a few aspects of the webinar that um, I was not too enthusiastic about.
Okay.
And one, it was the praise that was being heaped on Harvard's leadership for defending itself against the Trump attacks. I just don't understand and why, like, why the praise when it's an existential moment and it's either give up the institution or you leverage the massive, massive resources that the institution has um, in defense of both itself and the entire sector. Um, because I think and so this was part of what I wrote about a
A
month
month
ago,
ago,
where it's
yeah.
um, well, if Harvard's going to get praise, and really who should be getting praise first is Harvard's faculty AAUP chapter that was actually the first to file a lawsuit against the Trump administration. And the combination of that lawsuit plus building pressure from campus stakeholders, from alumni,
Hmm.
and from the demands that came from the Trump administration that literally would have left Harvard with nothing with respect to calling its an institution. Um, I don't like it just to me, the fact that Harvard is now simply trying to defend itself against an existential threat. It's through its leadership. Like that actually seems to be the bare minimum. I think that what would be more appropriate is to, yes, identify that what Harvard is doing is right in terms of defending itself, but pushing it leverage its to leverage all of its resources, including aspects of its endowment that it has access to create the nationwide mutual defense pact that enables all universities to come together and jointly defend against all of these attacks.
And
Um,
Jonathan, I'm just going to stop you for 1 second because a part of their resources and what they're able to marshal is the Harvard Business School. Okay. And again, I mentioned how they want to start taking over corporate boards. Their impact, their tentacles, their arms are so huge, Jonathan, in every aspect of science, of business, of education, that they can really not only bring this together, but this is the moment that you must bring it together. Because the only way to have change happen is that it can't just happen through the higher education academic field coming together. They have to recognize that they have such huge influence in so many other arenas, and there is an obligation on those folks to show up as well.
yeah, and I think for me it's also just skepticism that Harvard is as great as we make it out to be. Like if we're thinking about social mobility, Harvard is certainly not the institution that is enabling folks who come from more sort of modest working class backgrounds to sort of climb the economic ladder. You're much more likely to get that from a place like um,
Queens
from
College.
or like one of like UMass, like
Yeah,
one of the state schools,
right.
um, which is just to say that Harvard should earn this praise. Again, that's not to discount the fact that Harvard actually needs to stand, because if it
Yes.
falls, the Trump administration's assault on higher education as part of a broader fascist authoritarian playbook, it's going to take everyone out.
Yeah.
Um, but this is a moment in which, like, I do not think anyone should be donating money to Harvard. Like, just as an example, like if you want to donate money, there are a lot of like institutions that are far less resourced than Harvard that do far more with their resources for the common good. Um, and so, that should be spread out. But it's also, again, against this backdrop of Harvard, through its failure to zealously defend its own policies, because that would have required it to simply foreground all the ways in which it continues to dole out racial preferences, to wealthy white applicants. Like, just footnote, as far as I know, Harvard continues to extend legacy preferences and donor preferences and
Yeah.
athlete preferences. What the folks who were suing Harvard acknowledged constituted a massive advantage for wealthy white applicants. And so I'm just like less sympathetic to Harvard. And also in Harvard's brief, challenging the Trump administration's effort to withhold, I think, $2.2 billion in funding,
Right.
predicated on what is obviously pretextual Title VI violation, sort of on the basis of anti-Semitism. Uh, Harvard, part of what Harvard was said in that brief is, well, the institution, or excuse me, the Trump administration should not come after it because it had been disciplining students hard enough,
Yeah.
because it had been taking all the steps necessary in order to combat the sort of
So they were
spread of.
justifying the suggestion of the anti-Semitism by saying, look what we're doing, we're combating it. Well, wait a minute, you
Yes.
can't combat it if it doesn't exist.
And also, Harvard also mentioned that it had adopted the
Definition.
widely criticized definition of anti-Semitism that the Trump administration is pushing. This is the one that effectively um, uh, prohibits criticism of Zionism or criticism of Israel, both of which are like obviously legitimate academic discourse on university campus. But again, when I am just articulating sort of my hesitation, my reticence to go all in with Harvard, is because there's ways in which Harvard can, even as it is defending itself, it is failing to use its massive resources, all the its prestige, all the benefits that it enjoys, in order to protect the common good, aside from just being this bulwark against a flood that's going to take everyone out. And even in its responses to the Trump administration, it is reifying the fundamental story that the Trump administration is saying, and but responding, look, like, we actually did crack down on our students in the way that you wanted us to, so
Exactly.
get off our back.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, Massa, is what they said to the Trump administration. We only have a few minutes left. And so I'm going to get you to come back, Jonathan, not on a Thursday, but on another day, because I think this is really an important conversation and we're not going to have time for it. You wrote the idea of Trump trying to make racial integration illegal. I want to just say that term over and over again. Racial integration illegal. And you wanted to look at a couple of examples. And one of the examples you wanted to look at was an example of what's happening to Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia. And you only have like 2 minutes, but can you at least wet our whistle and just give us an idea of what's happening at Thomas Jefferson? Because I'm bringing you back whether you like it or not.
Yeah, so the very, very short story, or very sort of concise retelling, is that so Thomas Jefferson High in Virginia, one of the top ranked public schools in the country, uh, has long had a sort of troubled history of just failing to integrate, particularly Black and Latina students, who, as recently as 2012, the NAACP had filed a civil rights complaint against Thomas Jefferson High because its admissions process was discriminatory with respect to African American students, Latino students, and students with disabilities.
Mhm.
In 2020, as global protests for racial justice erupted across the world, um, Fairfax County, they were grappling with the fact that there were so few black students at Thomas Jefferson High that it was too small a number to report in a county with over 100,000 black residents. And so what is it? What does the school do? It, just looks at its admissions process and sees the ways in which it is reproducing patterns of racial exclusion. It makes some changes, including getting rid of some standardized tests, actually increasing the GPA requirement, adding a sort of honors course requirement, then including some other factors. And what happened was it like increased the number of Black and Latino students. The overall number of Asian American students decreased, but poor Asian American students went up by a significant amount. And TJ was sued. TJ prevailed. The school prevailed in a case that reached the Supreme Court last year. Trump administration is reviving this investigation, even when it's already case closed. And what the Trump administration is effectively saying, I know I'm going over, is that it's illegal to intentionally try to racially integrate because that is a racial motive and we can't think about race.
And on that note, this is the Thursday edition of The Attitude. Every last Thursday of the month, we join Professor Jonathan Feingold of BU Law School for what? For Race Class, because race matters. Thank you so much for joining me, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Arnie.
You're welcome. This, everyone's Thursday. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.